Well, I mean, a lot of people don't know. Yeah, I'm a perfectionist. I'm a perfectionist, and when I reach a certain level, I want to go to the next level. So when
Yeah.
in Hollywood, with everything I've done, well, back then,
Everyone thinks they know Friday. They know the porch, the dam, and the weed. But behind the haze of the most iconic stoner comedy in history lies a story of 10,000-buck paychecks, real-life gang intervention, and a leading man who was actually vomiting between takes. Chris Tucker didn't just play Smokey, he survived him. Why did the biggest rising star in Hollywood walk away from a $12 million sequel? The answer is darker than you think. The production grit. You may ask, how did a movie shot in 20 days for pocket change become a global religion? Well, Friday feels so authentic and relatable because you have to realize that the production wasn't just set in South Central Los Angeles, it was consumed by it. When New Line Cinema greenlit the project with a meager $3.5 million budget, director F. Gary Gray and Ice Cube didn't have the luxury of building a controlled backlot at Warner Brothers. They didn't have high-tech security details or air-conditioned trailers for the talent. Instead, they took the crew to 126th Street between Halldale and Normandy Avenues. This wasn't a sanitized version of the hood. It was an active neighborhood in the mid-90s, a period where the echoes of the 1992 uprising were still vibrating through the asphalt. This was a place where the rules of a film set came second to the rules of the street, and that tension is baked into every single frame of the movie. The urban legend that fans often miss is just how close to the edge the production stayed during those 20 days of filming. The houses you see on screen weren't empty shells. They were occupied by families who were being paid a few $100s a day to let a film crew take over their lawns. Because they were filming in a neighborhood with an active gang presence, the production had to navigate a complex social hierarchy. It wasn't uncommon for OGs from the local set to wander onto the filming area to see what was happening. While Ice Cube had the neighborhood respect from his NWA days, the rest of the crew had to tread lightly. There is a specific grit in Chris Tucker's performance, a manic, darting energy that wasn't just acting. It was the vibe of a young comedian from Atlanta who suddenly found himself in the heart of one of the most notorious neighborhoods in America, surrounded by people who weren't extra casting, but actual residents living that life. One of the most intense moments that everyone missed happened behind the scenes regarding the props. In a movie where the plot revolves around a debt to a dealer, guns are inevitably involved. During the filming of the climax, where the neighborhood is under the threat of a drive-by, the LAPD actually showed up and confiscated some of the firearms being used. The police weren't entirely convinced they were just props, and in the chaos of a low-budget shoot, the line between movie magic and public disturbance was razor-thin. The production had to scramble to find replacements just to keep the cameras rolling. This wasn't a movie made with a safety net. It was a movie made in the middle of a living, breathing ecosystem that didn't stop for action. Then there's the story of the real-life Big Worm. While the character played by Faison Love is a masterpiece of comedic menace, he wasn't purely a creation of the script. The character was inspired by a real figure from the neighborhood who reportedly made his presence known on set. Imagine trying to film a comedy while the actual inspiration for your villain is standing 10 feet away, making sure you're representing the lifestyle correctly. This added a layer of psychological pressure to the cast. They weren't just trying to be funny. They were trying to be accurate enough to stay in the good graces of the people who actually lived on 126th Street. The logistical nightmare extended to the physical environment. The heat in LA during that shoot was oppressive. Because the budget was so low, they couldn't afford honey wagons or sophisticated cooling systems. The cast spent 12 to 14 hours a day sitting on that iconic porch, breathing in the smog and the tension of the street. This lack of comfort is actually what gives the film its hangout feel. When you see Ice Cube and Chris Tucker looking exhausted and drained, they aren't just portraying two guys with nothing to do on a Friday. They are two actors who are genuinely drained by the grueling pace of a 20-day shoot in a high-stress environment. Everyone missed the fact that Friday was essentially a documentary disguised as a stoner comedy. Every background character, every dog barking in the distance, and every rusted-out car was part of the reality of 1995 South Central. The miss for the general audience is thinking this was all a carefully constructed parody. In reality, it was a group of young, hungry black creators reclaiming their neighborhood by turning the trauma of the hood movie genre, which was usually violent and depressing, into something human and hilarious. They were filming in a war zone, but they were determined to make the world laugh at the absurdity of it all. It was a high-wire act of cultural diplomacy, and the fact that they pulled it off without a single major incident is a testament to the respect Ice Cube commanded. But if the set was dangerous, why was the lead actor actually the one in physical pain? The smoke and mirrors. When you watch Friday, you're watching a masterclass in physical comedy. Chris Tucker's portrayal of Smokey is so convincing that he became the universal poster child for stoner culture. For decades, fans assumed that Tucker was simply method acting, that he was probably as high as a kite while lounging in those lawn chairs. But the reality behind the scenes was a total 180 from the chill, laid-back vibe portrayed on screen. In fact, for Chris Tucker, the process of filming Friday was a physically grueling, nauseating ordeal that almost broke him before the cameras stopped rolling. The biggest secret everyone missed is that Chris Tucker wasn't actually smoking marijuana. Because he didn't want to be impaired while trying to nail his first major leading role, the prop department provided him with herbal cigarettes. These weren't the high-end, actor-friendly smokes used on big-budget sets today. These were harsh, cheap mixtures of tobacco, marshmallow leaves, and various bitter herbs. Tucker, who wasn't a heavy smoker in real life, had to puff on these concoctions for 12 to 14 hours a day to maintain the continuity of the scenes. By the second week of production, the constant inhalation of these stunt substances began to take a massive toll on his body. Tucker has since revealed that he was frequently, violently ill between takes. There's a specific irony to the Smokey persona. While the character was supposed to be feeling euphoric and relaxed, the actor was often ducking behind the houses on 126th Street to vomit. The lethargic, heavy-lidded look that fans associated with being high was often just genuine physical exhaustion and the pale haze of nicotine poisoning. When you see Smokey staring off into space or moving with a slow, deliberate cadence, you aren't just seeing a stoner. You're seeing a man trying to keep his lunch down while the California sun beats down on his head. This physical discomfort actually added a layer of unintended genius to the performance. Because Tucker was feeling so physically off, his improvisations took on a manic, desperate energy. He wasn't playing a cool stoner. He was playing a guy who was constantly on the verge of a panic attack because he owed money to a psychopathic dealer. That high-pitched, fast-talking delivery became his trademark, but it was born out of the necessity to keep the energy up while his body was telling him to shut down. He was essentially running on adrenaline and ginger ale, fueled by the knowledge that this was his one shot at Hollywood stardom. Then there was the psychological shadow cast by the real Big Worm. While Faison Love's portrayal of the ice cream truck titan is legendary, the character was a composite of several high-level street figures the neighborhood residents knew all too well. Tucker had to play the subservient role to this menace, and the tension on set was amplified by the fact that real-life worms were watching from the sidelines. There was a constant pressure to make sure the culture wasn't being mocked in a way that felt disrespectful to those who actually controlled the territory. Tucker had to balance being the funny guy with the reality that his character was essentially a dead man, walking if he didn't come up with $200. Another layer everyone missed was the prop weed itself. In the mid-90s, the visual of a fat sack of weed was a status symbol in the genre. However, because the budget was so low, the production couldn't afford realistic-looking synthetic buds. Most of the greenery you see in the film was actually crushed-up moss or dried cilantro purchased from a local grocery store. Tucker would often have to handle this product with a straight face, pretending it was high-grade chrono when it actually smelled like a kitchen pantry. This disconnect between the cool lifestyle being depicted and the cheap, gritty reality of the props is a testament to Tucker's ability to sell a fantasy. By the time they reached the angel dust scene, where Smokey ends up in a pigeon coop, Tucker was at his wits' end. That scene is often cited as the funniest in the movie, but for Tucker, it was the culmination of weeks of physical sickness and the absurdity of the shoot. He wasn't just acting crazy in that coop, he was leaning into the total exhaustion of the 20-day production. He took the discomfort of the tobacco herb smokes, the heat of South Central, and the pressure of the low-budget hustle, and he channeled it into a performance that defined a generation. He made the struggle look like a party, and that is the greatest trick he ever pulled. Was it just the sickness, or was there a deeper reason the funniest man in Hollywood vanished? The $10,000 insult. In the glitz and glamour of modern Hollywood, we are used to hearing about superhero actors taking home 20 million paychecks, plus a percentage of the back-end profits. But in 1995, the landscape for independent black cinema was a different, much more predatory world. The most shocking detail that Chris Tucker has revealed in recent years, the one that makes fans do a double-take, is the actual number on his paycheck for playing Smokey. For creating one of the most iconic, quotable, and culturally significant characters in the history of film, Chris Tucker was paid a flat fee of $10,000. When you break that down, the math is staggering. The movie took 20 days to shoot. If you factor in the 12 to 14-hour days, the physical toll of the stunt smoking, the danger of the neighborhood, and the sheer amount of improvised genius Tucker brought to the script, he was essentially working for scale. He has famously noted that the catering budget for the film was likely higher than his salary. At the time, Tucker was a hungry comic coming off the Def Comedy Jam circuit. $10,000 felt like a fortune to a kid from Atlanta, but it was a pittance compared to the hundreds of millions of dollars the Friday franchise would eventually generate in box office sales, DVD rentals, and merchandise. This insult of a paycheck became the catalyst for the biggest mystery in comedy: why Tucker refused to return for the sequels. For years, the rumor mill suggested that Tucker was too big for his boots, or that he and Ice Cube had a falling out over ego. But the truth is rooted in a mix of financial self-worth and a profound moral pivot. When the time came to film Next Friday, the studio finally realized Tucker's value. They came to the table with an offer that most people wouldn't just accept. They would kill for it. Tucker was offered between $10 million and $12 million to put the khaki pants back on and play Smokey one more time. He said no. To the suits at New Line Cinema, this was insanity. To the fans, it felt like a betrayal. But for Tucker, the amount he made on the first film had bought him something more valuable than money: perspective. During the years between the first film and the development of the sequel, Tucker underwent a significant spiritual transformation. He became a born-again Christian, and his outlook on the content he put into the world shifted dramatically. He looked back at Smokey, the dealing, the constant profanity, the glorification of the weed man lifestyle, and realized he didn't want that to be his legacy. He didn't want to be the reason young kids thought smoking weed and dodging responsibilities was the pinnacle of cool. There was also the principle of the matter. Tucker felt that the studio had exploited the cast on the first film. While he didn't harbor a grudge against Ice Cube, who was also a producer trying to make a movie on a shoestring budget, he felt that the industry at large viewed black talent as disposable. By walking away from $12 million, Tucker performed one of the most gangsta moves in Hollywood history. He proved that he couldn't be bought. He wasn't going to compromise his newfound values for a payday, even if that payday was 1,200 times larger than his original salary. Everyone missed the fact that Tucker's exit wasn't about diva behavior. It was about a man reclaiming his soul from a character that had started to define him too narrowly. He saw the Smokey trap, the risk of being pigeonholed as the funny high guy for the rest of his career, and he chewed his own leg off to get out of it. This decision fundamentally changed the trajectory of the Friday franchise, forcing Ice Cube to pivot to the Mike Epps era. While the sequels were successful in their own right, they never quite captured the lightning-in-a-bottle magic of the original, precisely because the heart of that magic was a $10,000 actor giving a $1 million performance. The miss here is the realization that Tucker's absence from the sequels wasn't a loss of ambition. It was an exercise in power. In an industry that often chews up young stars and spits them out, Tucker decided to set his own terms. He used the success of Friday to jump into Rush Hour, where he commanded a $25 million salary, the highest in the world at the time, all while keeping his cleaner image intact. He proved that you could leave the porch behind and still own the whole neighborhood. So, if he wasn't Smokey anymore, who exactly did Chris Tucker become? The Def Comedy Jam DNA. To understand the lightning-fast reflexes Chris Tucker displayed on that porch, you have to go back to the smoky, high-stakes environment of the early 90s stand-up scene. Before he was a movie star, Tucker was a product of the Def Comedy Jam era, a period that redefined black humor for a mainstream audience. Born in Atlanta, Georgia, Tucker was the youngest of 6 children, a position that naturally forced him to develop a loud, attention-grabbing personality just to be heard at the dinner table. He took that youngest child energy and weaponized it on stage, moving to Los Angeles at 19 to chase a dream that most people in his hometown thought was a long shot. At the legendary Comedy Store on Sunset Boulevard, Tucker began refining a style that was unlike anything else at the time. While most comedians were leaning into the hard-edged, cynical observations of the post-Richard Pryor world, Tucker brought a frantic, almost musical energy to his sets. He was high-pitched, he was rubber-faced, and he possessed a physical fluidity that drew comparisons to a young Eddie Murphy or even Robin Williams. This was the DNA he brought to the character of Smokey. Everyone missed the fact that Smokey wasn't just a written character. He was a stand-up routine brought to life. When you watch Friday, you aren't just seeing a guy acting out a script. You're seeing a man who had spent years performing for the toughest crowds in America. In the Def Jam world, if you weren't funny within the first 30 seconds, the crowd would eat you alive. That survival instinct is what allowed Tucker to dominate every scene he was in. He knew how to find the pocket of a joke, how to use his voice as an instrument to punctuate a punchline, and how to use his eyes to tell a story without saying a word. He was the human cartoon that the movie needed to balance out Ice Cube's straight man persona. This era of Tucker's life was also his most prolific in terms of creative output. He was a regular on the road, honing the observational skills that allowed him to improvise iconic lines like, "You got knocked the F out," on the fly. That wasn't in the script. That was a comedian reading the room, or in this case, the street, and reacting with the perfect comedic beat. Fans missed the fact that Friday was essentially a filmed version of a legendary comedy set. However, the Def Comedy Jam circuit was also a double-edged sword. It rewarded the kind of raunchy, substance-centric humor that Tucker would later come to regret. During this period, he was fully immersed in the rock star lifestyle of a rising comic, where the lines between his stage persona and his real life began to blur. The manic energy that made him a star was also a mask for a young man trying to find his footing in a ruthless industry. He was the fastest-growing star in the comedy world, but he was also realizing that the Def Jam style had a ceiling. He didn't just want to be the guy making people laugh in a club. He wanted to be a global icon. But could that manic energy translate to the biggest buddy cop franchise in history? The Rush Hour pivot. The transition from the low-budget streets of South Central to the high-gloss world of international blockbusters was not an accident. It was a calculated move that everyone missed as the ultimate get-out strategy. While fans were mourning the loss of Smokey in the Friday sequels, Chris Tucker was busy engineering one of the most successful character pivots in cinematic history. He took the manic, fast-talking energy he cultivated in the hood and packaged it into Detective James Carter for the 1998 hit Rush Hour. This wasn't just a career move. It was a financial and cultural coup that saw him go from a $10,000 paycheck to becoming, for a moment, the highest-paid actor in the entire world. The secret to the Rush Hour success was a bizarre lightning-in-a-bottle chemistry with martial arts legend Jackie Chan that almost didn't happen. When they first met, the cultural divide was so massive that it mirrored the movie's script. Jackie Chan admitted that during the first film, he understood absolutely nothing that Tucker was saying. Tucker's heavy use of slang and lightning-fast improvisation left Chan staring at him in silence, wondering how they would ever finish a scene. Tucker, in turn, thought Chan didn't speak a word of English and panicked that the movie was going to be a disaster. Everyone missed that the frustration you see on screen between their characters was, at least initially, a reflection of their real-life confusion. However, that confusion became their greatest weapon. Tucker realized that he didn't need to be the stoner anymore. He could be the bridge. He used his comedy to humanize the action, turning Jackie Chan's incredible stunts into a two-man dance of East meets West. By the time Rush Hour 2 was greenlit, the studio knew they had a goldmine. Tucker, remembering the meager $10,000 from Friday, didn't just ask for a raise. He demanded the keys to the kingdom. He negotiated a record-breaking contract, eventually landing a staggering $25 million salary for Rush Hour 3. This was a pay-or-play deal, meaning he got the money even if the movie didn't get made, plus 20% of the gross profits. This pivot allowed Tucker to retire the Smokey archetype while maintaining his status as a comedic titan. He proved that his talent wasn't tied to a specific genre or a specific set of hood tropes. He could walk onto a set in Paris or Hong Kong and still be the funniest man in the room, all while keeping his content cleaner to reflect his evolving personal values. Everyone missed the fact that while the industry was trying to keep him on that porch in South Central, Tucker was busy fleeing first class around the globe. He had successfully traded the $10,000 insult for a fortune that would allow him to walk away from Hollywood whenever he felt like it. But this sudden wealth brought its own set of complications. When you go from 0 to 25 million in a single decade, you become a target for everyone, from greedy managers to the IRS. Tucker's career began to slow down, not because he lost his touch, but because he could finally afford to be the most selective actor in the business. What happens to a man's psyche when he's the richest guy in the room, but hates the script? The spiritual sabbatical. In the late 2000s, at the absolute height of his earning power, Chris Tucker did something that almost no one in the history of Hollywood does. He simply stopped. While the industry was clamoring for a Rush Hour 4 or a Friday reunion, Tucker vanished from the spotlight. This wasn't a falling off or a lack of opportunities. It was a deliberate, profound spiritual sabbatical. After years of being the human cartoon and the fast-talking comic, Tucker underwent a major lifestyle shift that everyone missed as the true reason for his disappearance. He returned to his roots as a born-again Christian, and this newfound faith acted as a filter that suddenly made most Hollywood scripts look like garbage to him. This transformation was more than just a surface-level change. Tucker began to audit his own legacy, looking back at the character of Smokey through a lens of responsibility. He felt a deep sense of conviction about the influence he had over young fans. He didn't want to be the guy who made addiction look like a harmless riot anymore. He began to realize that while the money was astronomical, the spiritual cost of playing characters that leaned into negative stereotypes was becoming too high. This is the period where he turned down tens of millions of dollars. To the average person, saying no to $12 million for next Friday is a sign of insanity. To Tucker, it was a sign of salvation. He was choosing his soul over his bank account, a move so rare in Los Angeles that people assumed he had simply lost his mind. During this missing decade, Tucker redirected his manic energy toward humanitarian work. He began traveling extensively throughout Africa, partnering with leaders like Nelson Mandela and Bill Clinton to raise awareness for the AIDS crisis and poverty. He wasn't doing this for a PR stunt or a documentary. He was doing it because he finally had the time and the resources to see the world beyond the lens of a movie camera. Everyone missed the fact that the guy who played the most famous stoner in history was now spending his days in rural villages, using his wealth to build infrastructure and provide medical aid. He traded the roar of a film set for the quietude of service, and it fundamentally changed the way he approached his craft. When he finally did return to the screen in films like Silver Linings Playbook or Air, he was a different man. The high-pitched franticness had settled into a grounded, seasoned presence. He was no longer trying to prove he was the funniest man in the room. He was proving he was a legitimate actor. He had survived the meat grinder of 90s superstardom and came out the other side with his values intact. He proved that you could be a legend without having to be a workhorse. By stepping away, he preserved his mystique. In an era where every celebrity is overexposed on social media, Tucker's silence made his rare appearances feel like an event. He showed the world that true power isn't about how many movies you make, but about having the freedom to say no until the right one comes along. In an era of reboots and nostalgia, is there still a seat at the table for a 50-year-old Smokey? By Felicia. The final secret everyone missed about Friday is its incredible viral longevity. Usually, a low-budget comedy from 1995 would be a nostalgic footnote, a you-had-to-be-there moment in time. But Friday didn't just stay in 1995, it evolved into a permanent fixture of the global lexicon. From the By Felicia meme that became a universal dismissal used by everyone from suburban teenagers to talk show hosts to the slang sound bites that dominate sports highlight reels, the film's DNA is everywhere. The irony is that the missed details, the low pay, the tobacco sickness, the gang-ridden set, are exactly what gave the film the grit required to last 30 years. It feels real because it was real. It wasn't a polished corporate product designed by a committee. It was a group of young black men and women in South Central telling their own story on their own terms. When Chris Tucker walked away from the franchise, he inadvertently sealed the original film's status as a sacred text. Because there was never a true sequel with the original duo, the 1995 version remains untainted, a perfect time capsule of a specific moment in American culture. Today, Chris Tucker is an elder statesman of comedy. He's the guy who beat the system. He took a $10,000 role, turned it into a $50 million career, and then had the discipline to walk away when it no longer aligned with his spirit. Everyone missed the fact that Friday wasn't just a movie about a couple of guys on a porch. It was the launching pad for a man who would redefine what it meant to be a black superstar in Hollywood. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss the real story behind the legends.